So we place a strong emphasis at the Centre for Transport and Society on the links between our research and our talk programmes, particularly our MSc in Transport Planning, which in fact includes a module specifically covering issues of transport and urban design. And our debate topic for this evening, in fact, emerges from an impressive MSc dissertation project undertaken fairly recently, covering the case study of Ashford and by Simon Moody. And he was supervised by Dr. Steve Melia on the far left. So the work questioned some of the outcomes of the major revisioning and reconstruction of the former Ashford Ring Road, which took place over the last decade, a transformation which Ben Hamilton-Baillie's company has made a very significant strategic input. And there is no doubt that that particular ring road needed some radical intervention. In fact, for several years prior to the remodelling, we took around 100 master's students a year to Ashford to understand how you don't do either urban design or transport planning. So the subsequent media and professional attention around the findings from the dissertation covering Ashford led to the idea to explore through a public debate the question of sharing or separation, which way for streets of the future. So our format for the evening will be that each of our speakers will have around 20 minutes to put his case. This will then be followed by around 30 to 40 minutes for members of the audience to make comments. And I would encourage you on this occasion to make comments. Sometimes we prefer questions and it's almost a criticism if you're making it a comment, but we're interested to hear your views as well. Indeed, the speakers will then have 5 minutes each at the very end to respond to your views. So it'll be more comments followed by a response rather than a question and answer session. However, if you do have any questions for clarification, of course, that's fine. So we have an almost full house this evening, and I'm warned that you might be a difficult lot to handle, so I look forward to your cooperation, please. I think the good turnout underlines the importance with which this issue is being viewed by the built environment professions. So before introducing our two speakers, I'd like just to emphasise that the aim of this debate is not about what should have happened specifically in Ashford or what should happen in Bristol or indeed anywhere else specific, but we're here to explore in more general terms the generalisable principles of what Professor Carmen Hasklau once called streets as living spaces. No doubt most of us will share much in common, I hope, in terms of our desire to work towards a built environment which prioritises people and activities over vehicles and movement. But the devil, of course, as ever, is in the detail. So Ben and Steve have agreed that Steve will first put the case for segregation. Steve Melia is a senior lecturer in transport and planning at the Centre for Transport and Society here at UWE. His research has focused on alternatives to car use in different contexts. His PhD was completed in 2009 and explored the potential for car-free development in the UK. This involves studying car-free developments in cities which have been successful in reducing car dependency across 7 European countries. And he's advised the Department for Transport and the Town and Country Planning Association in drawing up transport guidance for the Eco-Towns programme, and he was also on a recent roundtable of transport advisors to the Olympic Park Legacy Company. Torch, of course, passing somewhere through Bristol as we speak. So Steve will be followed by Ben, who will put the case for shared spaces, a term indeed which he himself coined in 2002. Ben's website describes him as qualified as an architect. He prefers to be seen as a recovering architect. He's worked in the fields of housing, transport and planning and set up his company, Hamilton-Baillie Associates, in 2003. He's had a lifelong interest in improving the quality of streets and public spaces and finds new ways to promote safety, economic vitality and civility. He has specialised in exploring a range of practical measures and principles to develop and refine innovative street design, especially in this emerging field of shared space. He serves on a number of regional design panels and is a visiting lecturer at the University of Bath, and I'm very pleased to say also the University of the West of England. So I'll hand you over to Steve first of all, who will be followed by Ben.
According to some versions of history, this is where it all started to go wrong. How many people recognise where that picture comes from? Yep. No, it was in fact the report, Traffic in Towns, commonly known as the Buchanan Report in 1963. And this report has been criticised for many of the mistakes which have been made in urban planning in the succeeding decades. The ugly concrete architecture, the urban motorways, but critically also, from many critics recently, the whole principle of separating different modes of movement. Now, in fact, the most radical, and I would argue the most important recommendation in that report was never really implemented in this country and has to some extent been airbrushed out of history. That is the concept of the environmental area. And it's one which I believe continues to have value for us here today. The concept was that if we were going to have more traffic in towns, then one of the things that we needed to do to manage that process was this sort of combination of pedestrianisation and closing off roads in ways which allowed people to move but restrained the movement of vehicles. Now, what I've discovered on my travels around sustainable cities all across Europe is that variations on that concept of the environmental area are alive and well in many of the cities that we look to as best practice, both in sort of city centres and in many residential areas. I also noticed that in most of these cities, most of the ones where car use is lowest, they separate the modes far more systematically than we do in this country, particularly in circumstances where volumes of traffic are high. There are three reasons for separating. One is to give an advantage to those modes that we want to encourage. This is the concept of filtered permeability, about which I've written elsewhere. Secondly, if you want to create places in cities which are solely for people, then by definition, you have to separate. And some of those places are amongst the most valued in many of our towns and cities. And then finally, in many of the places that I've been, I've observed this principle of separating to protect the non-motorised modes, walking and cycling. Now, protection in this context is about much more than accident statistics. That is the fundamental mistake which so many traffic planners have made in this country. If we want to encourage modal shift, if we want people to walk, to cycle, to use public transport instead of driving, then we have to create an environment not only which is safe, but which feels safe and feels comfortable. And separation is essential in many circumstances to achieving that. Now, this is the part of the Ashford Ring Road which has already been mentioned, where Simon Moody did his research and on which we based the paper. For those of you who haven't read it, it's available on UE's repository. I don't have time to say much about it, except to say that it did reveal some of the downsides to sharing space in environments of heavy traffic flow. The car tends to predominate. It is the decision of the driver whether or not to give way, and in most circumstances we observed that they did not. And we also discovered, and there's a growing body of evidence that supports this, that women, older people, and also people with certain range of disabilities in other studies tend to be much more negative about shared space than do young, fit, able-bodied men. That report also takes issue with some of the evidence, or rather the interpretation of evidence, which led to Local Transport Note 111 on shared space. Again, I don't have time to describe it all, but simply to say that there are flaws in the way that that evidence was interpreted, and maybe we can talk about that in the debate if you wish. Now, does that mean that I'm saying we should never have shared space? Certainly not. There are some circumstances where, as long as there have been vehicles, they have always shared space with pedestrians, and there are some circumstances where it would actually be very difficult to do anything else. Some of the examples which Ben is going to show you, I have no doubt, have brought significant improvements to the places where he has been working. This is not, as we've said on several occasions that we've discussed this is not a black and white issue, and we're trying to tease out the truth, if you like, in a circumstance which is still evolving. But I do have a number of problems with the way that the shared space movement has achieved such a degree of influence in this country that has led to this belief that in principle sharing space is better than separating. And what this has meant is that firstly, in many circumstances where more radical options were possible, those options have not been considered. Many of the developments which have been described or promoted as being sustainable developments, places like Poundbury are actually giant car parks. And some of the places which are under planning, such as Sherford in Devon, have deliberately avoided those techniques, such as pedestrianisation, which we know work. At the opposite extreme, we have the example of Nelson in Lancashire, where the council decided to actually rip out the pedestrianised shopping area and replace it with a street open to traffic. Now, there are several reasons why some planners and transport planners advocate all of this. Some of it is based on prejudice about what brings business to shops. Another argument, which I've heard many times, runs like this. In the 1960s and 70s, we went round building ugly places like this, shopping areas, pedestrianised shopping areas, where all life disappears from about 6 o'clock onwards, apart from a handful of youths hell-bent on causing trouble. The solution, from this perspective, is bring back cars, bring back vehicles. Now, what that fails to take account of is A, what caused the problem in the first place, and B, what other solutions are possible. All around Europe, you will see that the two main problems have been solved by, firstly, introducing nighttime uses, and secondly, by bringing places for people to live in pedestrianised centres. Too many planning authorities in this country believe that if you can't get a vehicle up to the front door and you can't give lots of parking, that nobody will want to live there. This example that I'm showing you here, Princess Hay in Exeter, is just one of a relatively small number of examples in Britain which demonstrate that that is not true. These are the people who queued out in the street overnight to be the first ones to be able to buy the first phase of these flats, which had no parking and no vehicular access, and have sold for some of the highest prices that have ever been charged in the centre of that city. Now, the other issue I've got with this concept that sharing is better than separating concerns the distinctions between the non-motorised modes. In all of the cities that I have ever visited, where both walking and cycling make a significant contribution to modal share, I have noticed that they have many differences, but one thing in common. All of them have comprehensive networks of separation, both between cyclists and general traffic, but also, particularly in those high volume areas, between cyclists and pedestrians. In some cases, as you can see in the bottom, the same is also true of public transport. Now, instead of that, in this country, we have the shared surface, the shared pavement, stopping at every side road, and the shared bus lane. Coupled with the belief that we don't need to worry too much about how well designed or how direct or convenient any of that lot is, because really that's just for kids and beginners. Real cyclists want to be out there mixing it with the traffic. And what all of that has collectively resulted in is, firstly, is a great deal of conflict, which some of us experience every day, or at least every week. Conflict between pedestrians and cyclists, conflict between cyclists and bus drivers. And in the absence of some radical change, as far as I can see, cycling in this country seems doomed to remain the marginalised activity of a small and increasingly demonised minority. So for my vision for the cities of the future, I would start by looking back to Buchanan's concept of the environmental area. I would like to see more spaces purely for people within our cities, both in city centres and also in car-free residential areas. I believe that we should separate in order to give an advantage to those modes that we want to encourage, and to both to protect and to give the feeling of protection and comfort to the non-motorised modes. And yes, in some circumstances, in some contexts, shared space will inevitably form part of that. I would suggest, particularly in those circumstances where traffic volumes are low. But in towns and cities where space is limited and under pressure, the ideal that policymakers and transport planners should be striving towards should not be to share that precious space with motor traffic, but wherever possible, to reclaim it for cycling, for walking, for people, for all of those activities which make our cities and our neighbourhoods what they are, and which flourish best when traffic is removed.
Thank you, Steve. I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you, because I'm not actually going to particularly make the case for shared space. The reason for this is I think that I would like the debate and the points to come more from you. But I want to just make a few observations, both about to follow up and to complement Steve's historical analysis, to try and define why we have a problem, what are the issues, and then to give a few just run through a few examples of a wider range as possible in order to feed and inform and provide reference points for this debate, rather than to answer those points directly. But I wanted to start really with questions about streets and life, about what we think of and what we have always thought about streets. And I thought it was just fun to start with a bit of film clip, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This is San Francisco's Market Street in 1904, was it 05? tragically, about 2 days before the earthquake and subsequent fire destroyed much of this. But it's interesting and I find very moving because it's one of the earliest pieces of film of streets that we have. And it's a sort of extraordinary, almost balletic interaction between all sorts of different movement activities. The filmmaker must have strapped his or her camera onto the front of a tram moving steadily along Market Street. And I still find it an intriguing picture from 100 years ago. Isn't this a mean-looking policeman? God, I wouldn't have tangled with him. But there is something, I think, remarkable and reminiscent of other sorts of complex circumstances that emerges from that. Of course, at about the same time as that was filmed, other pioneering engineers, Eugene NR particularly, a little known but I think very interesting proponent and urbanist of the early part of the 20th century, was beginning to explore the need for and different models for handling traffic in towns. This was a sketch, one of many of his, for the Place de l'Opéra in Paris, and you can see segregation of different levels, pedestrian underpasses, traffic circulating in a regular direction around a roundabout, a new idea, one that he invented. This debate we're having this evening is not a new one. It has been going on for many years. But I think that the Buchanan report and the subsequent decisions that were made and what was implemented and what was not has clearly, for better or worse, given us our current legacy. And I suppose the area about concern for me is distilled most succinctly in the safety campaign poster put out by the then Ministry of Transport in the 1980s, which defines these two very distinct worlds of the public realm, the pedestrian world and the carriageway, with extremely strong psychological as well as physical emphasis given to the curb as a boundary between two quite different worlds. And the penalties, of course, for transgressing that, if you make a mistake, were pretty serious. And it was this poster which has always struck me as interesting perception of how we wish to think of a large part of our public realm. I hope, just to indulge myself with those of you, many of you from Bristol, and I wanted just to use a quick photographic essay, just some snaps taken just the other week of a place that most of us are familiar with, the Arches in Gloucester Road, the bottom end of Gloucester Road. And not to say necessarily too much about them because we're so familiar with it, but just that to observe the way in which we currently fill and use and configure our space and the sort of relationships and expectations that it develops. And I don't know about you, but there is something about every time I walk or bicycle or drive across this space, I think we can do better than this. There's something about the predominance of highway elements, the aggressive tank trap curbs that are positioned in the middle of the road, the signals, lines, markings and barriers and so on, that I feel every time I pass here, there's something we could do, certainly using many European examples, our own skills, to do better than this. And I don't know whether others share that same perspective as me. I'd be interested to know whether these sort of places, of course I've only chosen one, there are dozens and dozens and dozens, not just in Bristol but around the country, that one could have picked. And perhaps I'm unkindly caricature some of the way in which we treat our public space with this cartoon. Perhaps I'm unkind, but I'm sure that what has happened is that the principles of the need to separate and segregate different activities and to try and accommodate them has given us in many places a fairly bleak, unattractive and not particularly useful public realm. And perhaps this is unkind, but whenever I go around the country and looking at different towns, attempts to filter or separate can, whether through poor design or through poor coordination, sometimes result in the most remarkably clumsy spaces or clumsy treatment of this is London. That aside, I think that most of us would agree that there are many spaces where somehow the balance between the use that we put to the spaces, the assumptions we make about the need to separate and divide different functions, has resulted in a fairly bleak urban environment, and one that does not necessarily help the economic attractiveness of such places. We also know from learning more about behavioral psychology and the way that the complex ways in which humans functions, that there are lots of places and spaces where we mix with traffic, whereas drivers, we're governed much less by the rules, but more by a whole complex range of social codes and courtesies and norms of behavior, which, in the absence of the rules and signs and markings, exert a much more powerful interest on our behavior. And it's really from the balance between the regulated, controlled, barriered world and the social protocols that the really debate about the potential for shared space emerges. Now, we know that there are lots of cities across the world, indeed in the UK, beginning to find different ways to adapt streets, particularly to accommodate some flows of vehicles, and we can debate how many they can cope with. This is in the city of Lund in Sweden, one of the first to explore how you created a coherent, larger scale, slow speed network. And of course, how to slow speeds in cities, how to supplement or do better than the mere application of speed limits is fundamental to this debate. Indeed, the whole question of how we can safely operate and move, navigate in space, use it as productively as possible, is intrinsically down to speed. So that much of the research and experimentation, successful or otherwise, is about ways to not only change speed, but also to change driver expectations and behavior. Now, much of that, of course, has been reflected in recent government policy, Manual for Streets and so on, has many of these principles implicit in it. And we're beginning to see many schemes, and many of you will be familiar with them. The one that perhaps most people recently know about in London has been the transformation of Exhibition Road in Kensington. An extraordinarily important public space, of course, linking together all the great institutions and museums. It was, of course, until formerly, not a particularly attractive public space, very limited space for the huge numbers of pedestrians and visitors and so on who took it, and a difficult street along its length to cross or to relate between the different uses and activities on both sides of the street. And for the last 10 years or so, I and many, many others have been working on ways of trying to rethink what a vision for that particular place, that particular context, unlike anywhere else, might emerge. And we're beginning to now see the first results of those efforts. A street, some argue not shared space, but certainly a single coherent surface which links the two sides of the streets and creates something different from the conventional street model. And I suspect that at the very least we may have learnt and advanced some lessons in how we might achieve that. But before going further, I think that it's useful to have one boring but important slide, which was one that the late Hans Mondermann helped, he and I assembled this, which is to point out the critical differences between two vital areas of infrastructure. We need highways, motorways, connections, transport links. They're part of our economic and social fabric. And for them to work well, they have certain characteristics. They tend to be highly regulated by the state. They're single purpose. We don't use them for any other means than moving as efficiently as possible from one place to another. They're highly systematic and consistent. And crucially, we rely on a very simple language of signs and markings in order to understand them. But everything since Jane Jacobs and her work that we've learned about successful public realm has exactly the opposite characteristics. It tends to work not very well when it's highly regulated and controlled by the state. On the contrary, it tends to be highly culturally defined, constantly changing, certain amount of unpredictability, highly contextual, and relies on a much more sophisticated human set of communications, one with another, that we use in everyday life. And I think it's this difference which is, I hope, at the heart of the debate about where the application of some of the social norms and interactions of integration can be defined. I just want to touch on a few examples, particularly locally. We don't have, it's not a term that was still very widely accepted, but in Bristol itself we have, for example, the refurbishment of Champion Square and River Street at John Richfield, and who's here, I think, and Jane Fowles from Novell Tullet helped transform the street. It's not entirely closed to traffic, although of course are very low volumes. You can see some of the movements in the snow. But you can see elements here, the positioning of the trees, their relationship to the space, a very strong sense of placemaking over the linearity of the street, which has begun to create a very different sort of space. Another example, again, a small scale, perhaps mundane one, but one that encourages me, is a transformation of an otherwise rather fast and bleak part of College Road in Clifton, which divided two parts of the school up there, the college in Clifton, and Phil Parker and his team at TPA, some very simple measures, simply to create a space which reflected the particular connections across that junction. And whilst it still accommodates the movement, it sets up an entirely different set of expectations between all of the different functions that space has to serve at different times of day. Another space that I suspect everybody here is familiar with, or at some stage or another, not often thought of necessarily as shared space, but the forecourt of Temple Meads is one that I have great admiration for, remodelled about 16 or 17 years ago, and it has to cope with an enormous number of movements of about 8 million passengers a year, arriving in all sorts of different modes. And the immediate forecourt, they've resisted the temptation to separate and provide formal crossings, but created, but through all sorts of particular means, we might discuss how that works, a space which copes with the movement across and between, as well as all the buses and taxis and other movements that sweep past the front of that space. It's a very unique place that has to cope with all sorts of greetings and partings and emotions and hurrying and so forth. But on a different level, there's emerging all sorts of other attempts to rethink the more mundane, not the city centre, but the high streets and shopping centres that make up such a large part of our urban fabric. This is another example from Bristol at the top of Kingstown Highbury, where the local community up there, keen to rebalance what this fragile shopping space might be, have come up with their own sort of fairly low-tech approach to remodelling that, to really give emphasis to the vital shops and connections, still cope with the traffic movement through there, but on very different terms through the way that the street is designed. And this question of high streets and how we model them is, of course, particularly crucial at the moment as such spaces come under threat. Examples such as the fairly small-scale high street Hamilton Road in Felixstowe was one example which decided against full pedestrianisation, but remodelled the street to allow for some degree of deliveries and movement and dropping people off, but we created a space which still copes with the principal activities of trade and street life in better ways. And I think that's this question of what streets are and what they might be is illustrated by some of the other busy examples. New Road in Brighton, not particularly busy for traffic, but remodelled from what was a very bleak and declining space a few years ago into somewhere a very different model that we've seen really to date in a large scale, a model for a street, one that becomes a quintessential part of the cultural quarter of that city, but can still cope with the taxis and buses that need to serve the two theatres and the other activities in that street, which copes with deliveries and different times of day, but has set up a space which doesn't rely on a regulated set of principles, but works through the messages, the story that the space tells in its own right. And it's, of course, a story that varies enormously at different times of day, different seasons, and so forth. We're beginning, of course, to build on other examples, and I just want to touch on, again, this was because we might refer to them in the debate of course, the work at Kensington High Street. Not usually thought of as shared space, although I would argue that it is, in the sense that what happened there was an attempt to re-establish the connections between both the purpose of the street as a focus point for shopping, fairly high-value shopping, and the huge, very busy movement, 42,000 vehicles a day that come up and down that street. It's, of course, not perfect, but the placement of the bicycles in particular in the central median and many other measures combine this formal crossing with encouraging informal crossing in a way that, of course, was not the case when the guardrails that lined both sides of the street and down the middle were in place and were seen to be essential for safety at that time. Now, of course, that change was one that was reflected in all sorts of other models from other parts of Europe as well as the UK. Hennef in Bonn was quite a long and fairly busy high street, which used this idea of edge friction very carefully, the idea of creating low speed, continuous movement and absence of signals or formal crossings, but to create a street which serves its complex purposes pretty well. And it's now 15 or 16 years old. Of course, it uses an informal median strip. The safety auditors among you, please note there's no keep right symbols on there, or keep left as they would be, and nobody's crashed so far. But it is a space which, a street which has seemed to set up a useful model. There are many others. I mean, this one I like very much in Lyngby or Langby, I can never pronounce it, in Copenhagen, with, again, very careful attention to the visual width of the street, the way it's perceived, and the use of courtesy crossings to reflect the way that pedestrians move that space. Very careful attention to detail and to dimensions, and in this particular case, creating an environment where the bicyclists are part of that mix and indeed help to create that speed environment. But of course, it's the speed which is essential to those spaces which have also began to look towards removing signals and controls. This was a problematic junction in the Swedish town of Norrköping, where the traffic signals were removed and a very strong sense of place established to encourage businesses to invest in this part of the university surroundings, but also to cope with the all sorts of movements that set up there. And of course, some pedestrians use it in different ways. Some use the frame that surrounds the edge and the guidance that goes with it, and some step across the middle. In other squares in Europe, we have a more formal application of shared space principles. This is Centralplatz in Biel or Biene, which is an interesting one, I think, because it copes with, again, the fairly significant amounts of vehicular movement, but does so in a way that doesn't seem to require the controls and divisions that other streets, and is a very lively and vital square, one that incidentally is formalized by the establishment in Switzerland and France from a Begegnungszone, as they call it. There's no good translation of that, a meeting space, a meeting area, maybe an environmental area, I don't know what one would call it, or zone de rencontre in France. Encounter zone doesn't really do it. But it's one that there's a debate about whether this approach should be formalized in some respects. But I think the issue of how we cross some of those major dividers, the barriers, is an area where it particularly has occupied us a lot in the last few years, and I think is an interesting one. How you get across those busy roads that inevitably build up around the edges of city centres. This is an example from Aachen in Germany, with the railway station in the bottom right and its connection to the city centre cut off by this inner road. But a very simple application of placemaking, this geometrical ellipse, seems to have been successful without having to close off the important link, but creates this extremely strong route and clear route which the drivers themselves can understand. So I think that applications that Ashford itself tried to tackle in dealing with the former ring road with its underpasses and so on is one that at least, as I hope, has made a start with all its other issues, which we no doubt will come on to. But it is an issue that applies to so many cities which are, Hereford, cut off by busy inner ring roads, which really don't allow the city to expand and don't allow them to, and different models I hope we can still explore. I do want to very briefly just touch on this, if it'll work, this brief clip from the city of Bern, because there, more than anywhere else I've seen, they've managed to set up this extraordinary low-speed relationship on fairly busy streets, which allow for this informal movement. It's a very complex way how that's been done. But I think, again, there may be hope for how that process might be applied and adapted to help us overcome some of these barrier effects. We might come back to that later on. Sorry? That's Königstrasse, that's right. And of course, we're using some of those principles, the removal of signals and lights in places like Poynton in Devon, in Cheshire, a town split in two by the very busy traffic that runs through it. It's one that simply won't work, a village that won't work without the connections being made. And trying to overcome those barriers by, in this case, the creation of a much reduced carriageway space in public square to transform this bleak environment as somewhere that could be a place. It's something that it applies, of course, in a rural area. We tend to this debate about merely town centres, but the application to villages cut in two by busy streets is something that I think, again, these principles could be useful for. This is in West Meon in Hampshire, a very simple, fairly low-cost application of removal of many things, the centre line markings and so on, has allowed a reduction in speed to take place without any changes in the regulatory framework. And we've tried to capture that in this publication with Dorset and Hampshire. But it doesn't necessarily mean roadworks. I mean, the village of Lockeridge managed to change speed by this scarecrow competition, simply populating and adding friction to adding human presence. But whether we go, as Beechcroft Road in Oxford did, to remodelling streets to take account of their domestic context, the tiling, or whether, as I think Professor Nishikawa, I probably haven't got your name right, but has come here from Japan, sent me these wonderful examples of rethinking a street in a university context to find ways to change expectations of drivers to be able to use somewhere for bicycles and so forth in a different way, and I thank you for that. But I thought we might just finish with my favourite example of where shared space works, a fairly busy, lively junction. I'm sure many of you know it, 7 Dials in London, and to thank particularly Jeff Haslam here for this film clip, which to me sums up the potential for creating a different relationship where cities continue to have to cope with deliveries and taxis and movement and so forth, but in ways that create very strong and attractive places. It's an interesting place because, of course, what you notice is the pedestrians appear to take very little heed of the drivers. They don't look at them. The drivers, on the other hand, of course, are highly alert and responsive to what's going on around them. But what I like about it is this notion of civility, of creating a driving environment where drivers are no longer barriered from contact, but can really anticipate and aware to, even if the major from Faulty Towers 20 years on wanders out and has as we all do, senior moments and may forget where he is for a moment. It doesn't matter, because what's been established there is this relationship that we use in everyday life as well. So briefly, I hope that there are elements in what we've been doing which might move us from this world to one that can allow the extraordinarily strong common courtesies and social codes to establish themselves and to create a different model for what streets might look like in the future. So thank you.
So I'm going to try to very briefly summarise, I think, what we've heard so far. Both presenters have placed their presentations very much in a historical context, and we can draw examples, I feel, from history to support both the view that segregation works well and indeed that sharing has worked well. I think there was a general view that segregation in general in the UK has sometimes been done very badly, be it through pedestrianisation or putting pedestrians behind barriers. And I think there is common ground in the sense that even a pedestrianised street is rarely entirely free of traffic at all times of day. So I think, in essence, the key debates here are around the importance of traffic flow on one side, and indeed the importance of modal shift. Can we achieve the modal balance necessary for shared spaces to work. And on the other side, I see it more around the issue of speed and psychological cue factors and indeed social norms. So I think those are the key points that are really taking out of those two contributions to the debate. So to remind you that we'd like you please, if you wouldn't mind standing up to make your comment, or indeed if you want to ask a question, please state who you are and an affiliation if you would like, and do wait for the roving mic, which I'm advised is very sensitive, so you don't need to hold it right up to your mouth. Pop star style, loosely down here works just as well. Thank you. So could I have a show of hands of people who'd like to make a presentation? Thanks. Okay. Well, let's start off with Hugh Barton, one of our professors of urban design, indeed, and planning.
Health and planning. Well, thank you both. It's Hugh Barton, Professor of, if I remember rightly, Planning, Health and Sustainability here at UWE. And thank you both very much, being the first to speak. I will do that from the bottom of my heart, because both were excellent presentations, and I was completely convinced by both of you. This is very difficult, therefore, for me to know what to say, except that I think eventually you're talking about slightly different things and different contexts. I'm reminded of a place in Gloucester, just towards the docks, between the city centre and the docks in Gloucester, where they it's part of the main sort of inner circuit of traffic. And it's not part of a shopping centre or major cultural activities, apart from being a routeway from the city centre to the docks. And they've made it shared surface, and I've often driven through there, I have to say. I've walked once, but it doesn't work because the level of traffic is so very high, and there's not the activities around it to justify a completely shared space. The people who are walking need to feel that there's some security. They need to feel where the bloody edge is, so where they're safe. And thinking about another example, one that you in fact used in Freiburg, of an area which is so-called car-free, where children can play in Vauban, the suburb of Freiburg, but actually the traffic is allowed as well. So it's not actually completely segregated, it's semi-segregated. So I think there are different situations where the different kinds of answer are appropriate. And I go with the view that there should be a network of cycleways, because without that, it's very difficult to encourage a major shift of mode towards that. But at the same time, I go with the view that that we need to humanize the spaces that we live in and move through. And where the traffic has to be, let's make sure that it doesn't dominate.
Thank you. Our next contribution, please. Over the back in the green jumper, sir.
My name is Godfrey Marx. I hesitate to speak amongst such a professional audience. I'm a layman. I come from Bradford-on-Avon, which has, as many of you may know, something of a problem. We have only one way across the river, and we have 20,000 vehicles per day across the bridge. We have narrow medieval streets, but for some difficult to understand reason, the local authority is trying to put in a shared space scheme. Now, this seems to me an example of exactly where it could go wrong, in fact. There could be negative consequences on both mobility and civility, because there is no alternative route through the town. I understand that one of Mondiman's first preconditions of this sort of thing was to have an alternative route, which we don't have. And the first part of this scheme, which is now being debated, involves taking away the only zebra crossing in the Market Street, which carries between 700 and 1,200 vehicles per hour. And I think it'll be negative on mobility because drivers will in fact be more frustrated by the addition of several courtesy crossings. Pedestrians will be in fact disadvantaged because whereas they did have right of way to cross on the zebra, they now have a confrontation crossing, as we would call it, rather than the courtesy crossing. And certainly old folks and the disabled, we think are very disadvantaged. And as a member of the public who's been involved for about 16 years with the problems of Bradford, we feel that unfortunately, although the decluttering and so on, we would appreciate, and upgrading of materials in what they call a historic core zone, fine, but the transport proposals we think are counterproductive. Thank you.
Thank you very much for updating us on that local situation. The speakers could refer to that if they want to later on, but I think we'll take some other points in the front row here, please.
Thank you. Ken Barker from Cardiff Cycling Campaign, a member of Cycle Nation Federation of Cycle Campaigns. I think I'm attracted to the idea of shared space as a cyclist, but clearly a lot depends on the capacity about the space available because, for example, in our pedestrianised area, there are times when it's impossible to cycle because of the sheer amount of movement and the number of pedestrians using the shopping street, or indeed during a rugby match when there are crowds. I'm just thinking, what is the prospects of being able to adjust the capacity of a street to cater for different levels of demand and different levels of use?
Thank you. Would you like to respond to that particular question?
Should we take it?
Yeah, okay. We'll take a couple. Take a couple more. Gentleman just there.
Thank you. I think they're very exciting and inspiring, your talks. Dick Daniel from Transition Bath, Transport and Built Environment Group. First thing that I wanted to say was that I think in terms of cycling, on any major route, to have completely separated cycling is vital, and actually sharing routes with fast-moving cars and heavy goods vehicles it just puts everyone off unless you're incredibly brave. The other thing I wanted to say was that it reminds me when you talk about places in Sweden and on the continent, about experience I had where my children were very young, about, I don't know, 4 years old or so, trying to cross the road in St Ives, and there was a crossing place, not a zebra, but a crossing place, and this taxi came whizzing along, and it was no way going to let me cross with my children. We pulled them back out the way. Then a bit further up, the pavement disappeared, so we had to cross the road a bit further up. The road stayed the same. There was enough for the vehicles to have their 2 lanes, but there was no pavement on that side. And this car stopped, and we were looking at it and wondering what it was doing. And it turned out, then I realised it was a Swedish car, and it just stopped to let us cross because it could see that we wanted to cross, and so we crossed. And it just struck me that was a completely cultural difference. One was a British driver and one was a Swedish driver. And then the third thing I wanted to say was that I think that you're not promoting some of the benefits that come from what you're talking about, modal shift and shared space, etc., which is that there are enormous health benefits. The social benefits you've talked about a bit, but I think you could say a lot more about them, and there are the environmental benefits. So,
yeah, hi, it's Phil Parker from Transport Planning Associates. Obviously, there's going to be places where cars and people mix. It's inevitable. So we can't rely on just having pedestrianised areas. However, what was interesting to me was the video clips that Ben showed. Uniquely, I think, showed that vehicles were moving very slowly and there were a lot of people. And I think the success of the shared space schemes relies on both those things, that there's people there and that speeds are slow. When I was happy, did a Churchill Memorial Trust travelling fellowship in 2006, and I had a day with Hans Monderman, who everyone's familiar with. But I also had a day with Joost Waal, who you may not be aware of. He was one of the forerunners of WUNERFs. And Joost said, Mondeman's too romantic for me. They both were trying to make spaces better for people, inevitably, but he said Mondeman's too romantic. He thinks that you can just change the things looking at it. The appearance will get people to slow down. You have to get these people to slow down physically. And I'm a great believer in actually producing physical measures that slow people down when they enter these spaces. And I think that is really a really important aspect. I think that we all learn from schemes that we do, and it's always nice when we promote our schemes and go, isn't this great? But I think we also ought to, because shared space is an evolving art, I also think that we ought to learn from the mistakes we make. Personally for me, I think the debate about Ashford is the problem of the speeds are too high. I think it's too straight, it's too wide, and I think that one of the things that we could learn from Ashford certainly is to physically get speeds down and to get things reduced in width. One of the clips or one of the pictures that Ben showed very nicely was a scheme in Bern, which you see all over France and all over the continent, where they have a central median, where it's split into two very narrow lanes. And I think that is so important to me because it gets people to cross in two widths. The lane widths are, say, 3 metres, so you can cross very easily. You're not crossing 6 or 7 metres like you're at Ashford. And I just believe that slow speeds and making sure there's people in that space and physical measures to keep speeds down are so important.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good moment to ask our speakers to briefly reflect on what they've heard so far. I'll ask Steve perhaps to go first.
Right, okay. Can you all hear me? We don't need the microphone for this bit. Is that okay? Yep. Right. Okay, there were several points there. Adjusting the capacity of a street was sort of a question which actually links in to some of what was said about Ashford, because to some extent that's what actually happened there. They reduced in some places the 3 lanes down to 2, and the flow of traffic was roughly halved according to the report that Kent County Council did. The average speeds were not actually that high. They're sort of 20 to 24 miles per hour. But it still creates an environment which feels very car dominated and which some people find rather intimidating. And it seems that, and I hope that some of this will emerge from future research, but there is something to do with the combination of the number of vehicles, the speed of the vehicles, the number of pedestrians, and the nature and the width of the space, all of which combine to either create a space which feels like sort of New Road Brighton where it works, or create a space like the Ashford Ring Road which doesn't feel particularly inviting for pedestrians. And so I think that there is still a big research agenda there to try and learn from experience and see where these things are appropriate and where they may not be.
Thank you. Hand over briefly.
Yes, I mean, there's some interesting issues here. I think just touching on Ashford very briefly, because clearly a lot of lessons have been learned from Ashford, and I mean, my small part in it, I don't regret the principles of how that scheme was tackled. I couldn't. They had to overcome the barrier effect of that road, and short of burying it in the ground or tunnelling under it, there was. It seemed that the approach, and I still think the approach was sensible. Of course, Ashford is difficult because it's only half finished. The intention at the time was to complete the second side of the street, the southern side of the street, which is still to be built. Which has meant that it's an odd street at the moment. It's only one-sided, and it's not got much pedestrian presence, or certainly nowhere near the levels that were anticipated. Just out of interest, the design speed we were working to at the time was between 18 and 19 miles an hour. That's what we were aiming for. And various, I think, misjudgments with hindsight, of course it's very easy with hindsight, allowed, I think, that speed to creep up to the low 20s, which is perhaps regrettable. But all the same, I think that, as you know, again, we've given the example, the different types of street experimented with. Some have central median strips, some don't. I think some of the spaces are a little bit too wide and too straight. But nevertheless, in broad terms, the scheme has worked in opening up access to the town centre from the railway station. It's clearly not popular, but then I think the expectations of the people should enjoy crossing a street with 10,000 vehicles a day is a bit unrealistic. It's never going to be popular. It certainly wasn't popular in the former situation. So, but I just want to touch on, there's an interesting other couple of points. The issue of cultural differences, I don't buy it, I have to say. And I don't buy it because we have looked at this in some detail as part of a European research project with a whole number of countries. And it's interesting how every country that we were examining said, oh, yeah, in Denmark, we have the most aggressive drivers. You in South Britain, you're so lucky, you're so polite. That's you, madam, all this stuff. It's extraordinary how we tend to always overplay cultural differences in our own circumstances. And the reason that I like the 7 Dials clip and examples is that there are all sorts of people. And I don't believe that the cultural expectations they maybe have relevance, but they're not that thick a veneer on how we behave. What shared space is doing is appealing to something about the way that human social interactions work, which is the same whether you're in a South American jungle or in Manhattan with the same creature. So I don't buy the cultural argument from my own experience. It's not particularly strong. But I do think that there are ways in which we continue to have to pit our minds to the realities of how we cope with towns that have, like Bradford on Avon does, huge volumes of traffic going through them. Now, I don't know the scheme, I don't want to get into the details of that, but nevertheless, like for better or worse, we have and will have towns and villages across the country that don't have the benefits of bypasses or alternative routes. We've let that build up. And where there are thousands of communities who say, tell us what we can do. All we have is some expensive and clumsy traffic calming or cameras or speed limits, and it's not working. So the search for some better language or richer language and drawing on experience of mainland Europe seems to me a very worthwhile undertaking. And we're not there yet, it's very early days.
Thanks. Richard.
I wasn't meaning that we're in any way different. I just think we've got used to allowing the vehicles to dominate and the drivers to think they can dominate.
Okay, thanks. Richard.
Richard Mann from Oxford. There's sort of so many aspects to this, but I think one what I will pick out is that one of the things that came in the NBA evidence to the local transport note was that there is a definite sort of step change in driver behaviour when speeds get down to about 15 miles an hour. And you can argue about whether it's precisely that. But I think there is some sense that there is a step change. It's the point at which people start recognising what's happening around them and start giving more care and more consideration to other users. And so actually, I think the critical thing is, how do we get people to slow down to that 15 miles an hour? And in some situations, fancy paving, no clues, taking away all of the highway engineering works. That's enough. But in others it doesn't. And I think what we find in Ashford in particular is that it isn't enough. And I think one thing that we're learning as these schemes are put in different places and different attempts are made is that actually one of the things that we end up putting in quite often in hindsight is a zebra crossing, because that actually helps slow people down because people are forced by law to take consideration of pedestrians crossing. And actually I think the key to this is trying to find ways of reducing the highwayness of some of these basic legal markings. I mean, I find it incredible that you walk around Brussels, for instance, I know fairly well, and there are zebra crossings at every side road, because a zebra crossing to them is just stripes on the road. And there's no diverting round to the middle of the block to cross. You just walk straight out and you expect priority and you get priority. But we have to have Belisha beacons, courtesy of Hort Belisha, and we have to have zigzags, which we can argue about they're 1 metre long or 2 metres long, or whether they're 2 of them or 4 of them or 8 of them or 16 of them. But actually, why do we have these zigzags? You look at the Abbey Road cover, it doesn't have zigzags. We invented that. If you look at that nice clip in Bristol Temple Mead Station, you'll see a little zebra with no zigzags and with no flashing lights. We can do this. We can adjust the way we've created markings to make them more shared spacey and less. And it's those things that will make shared space work, in my view. I think if we try and put in shared space without zebra crossings, with large amounts of traffic, inevitably they will fail. They'll be too fast, too motor dominated.
Claire Wilkes, a recent urban design master's student at UE. It is about the age of 3 that a child first understands the significance of a curb and can actually be allowed to run free down the pavement quite safely. And I'd like to know if there's much actual specific research that's been done into how young children perceive shared space, because I'm not convinced by that by that aspect of it.
Hello, I'm Keith Hallett. I think from the presentations we've heard tonight, for me, what comes over most clearly is that there is no rule book for shared space. And we are trying to search for a rule book for shared space. And I think that's where we're going wrong. We need, Steve needs a job, the university needs to do the research, maybe. But actually, what is most important is that there is no rule book which applies to shared space. It is each and every situation on its own merit. And that requires that we have people like Ben, whose grace, tenderness, understanding, application of deep and thoughtful thinking on each and every situation that he's been brought to. We need more Bens to be able to do that, not a rule book, because that picture that is now gone is the product of rule book. Traffic and transport has always been the product of rule books. And for the first time, we have had a man whose mission has been for so very long to tell us that actually we need to be looking at each individual situation and loving it to bits. Now, I think that requires, I'm sorry, I will complete, that requires not resorting to professionals, but every time I see us resorting to professionals, we slip into the same abyss of applying ourselves to the rule book. I think we need to come, and Dominic's laughing over there because he knows that I stand for community involvement in everything. And it seems to me that when you don't have, if you can't resort to professionals, you can only resort to people. And what you need to do is to resort to people across the board so that you have a really deep understanding of how people want to see things change. And then you need to apply lots of bends. I say, let's have lots of bends.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is David Cowdery. I'm from Guide Dogs for the Blind Association. Very interesting discussions that went on. Strange that none of you actually mentioned inclusivity at all at the beginning of it. So a point I would certainly like to raise, we believe that inclusivity should be at the heart of any design, and it should be accessible by all people. I agree with the points that were made about the volume of traffic. I believe that if you have high volumes of traffic, you can't possibly share the space. One or type of transport will dominate. A point that was raised earlier was about safe space. And I think that's a point that really should come across in all design. You need to consider vulnerable pedestrians, and safe space needs to be part of that. They're the main points I have to make. Thank you.
My name's Richard Burton. I'm the CTC Right to Ride rep for South Gloucestershire, and the more astute amongst you will have realised I'm a cyclist as well. So I'd like to talk about this as a cyclist, as I think we can all agree that these two solutions are context dependent. You can't fit shared spaces in high volume, high speed traffic, and segregation's inappropriate where volumes are low and traffic speeds are low. But as a cyclist, I'm slightly surprised that neither of you mentioned safety yet. I'm with my health and safety hat on. I'm very aware that we should be actually making the cause, the source of the danger, take the responsibility. And as I see it, shared spaces put the responsibility back on the people who are actually causing the danger, the drivers, and rigid segregation takes it away from them. And I really think that's a psychological point we need to think about very carefully. And as I understand it, the safety of segregated paths is in fact an illusion. It's a myth. There is data to show they are at least as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than riding on the road. So as a cyclist, I'm not in favour of them for that reason. I'm in favour of them when they give me an advantage for a route, or I can bypass traffic lights, or it makes me faster, it's more convenient. But as a general principle, I'm against segregation. Thank you.
Will Hoare from Bureau Happold. Recently been involved in a competition called London 2050, and obviously in London you're dealing with high volumes of movement, and as part of this competition we were looking at segregation, but not in terms of segregation. We were looking at segregation but from a different perspective, and that was time segregation. So for example, like Oxford Street, between the hours of midnight and 6 in the morning would be service vehicles only, and then 6 to 8 it would be public transport, and then you might have an hour's private vehicles, but then between 9 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the evening it'd be pedestrian only. It's just another comment, and you might sort of, because it was 2050, we were looking at sort of that sort of segregation being done mechanically. Perhaps you could you press a button and the curb lines moved and things like that. It's just another way of looking at it.
I'm Ryan Bunce. I'm a transport planner and former UE student, I guess. So I hope I don't say anything too embarrassing for the university. There's no point for or against shared space, or possibly against the point of having more bends, but it seems that a lot of street decisions are taken not by bends but by people in high-vis coats at the hard end that maybe haven't given it so much consideration. And it seems to be a tentative consensus that we need to decide where shared space is right and where segregation is right, and it's going to be a grey area. Which leads me to a sort of caution about the use of so much, I think use a nice term, photo essay, which I like as a concept, and if we're sitting here discussing it, it's very helpful. But for people maybe on the edge of the debate that are making a lot of decisions about it and don't consider the context in such a comprehensive or considered way as you or we might have done, it can be a bit misleading, and I wonder if that what leads to some of the habitual decisions and the habitual segregation or the habitual sharing where it's not right, because people have seen sort of some case studies and gone with that. So maybe we need to consider other ways of presenting our argument for other audiences.
Hello, I'm Chris Waller. I'm an architecture and planning student at UE. What I wanted to say was that the part of the idea of shared space, but also to in some contexts conventional traffic engineering, is the actual use of people as traffic calming. And one of the earlier comments was about the use of road narrowings. Now, when I'm cycling, these are not. When I'm walking, it's great, but when I'm cycling, the presence of a median on a narrow road is not of any benefit to me. It simply means that a driver behind me is putting me under psychological pressure, and it is a case of the cyclist calming the traffic rather than the traffic being calmed for the cyclist. And I think I think shared space needs to be used where traffic is able to be routed away from it as well. And I think a core grid of separated routes is better for cyclists, with the side roads for infill being mixed use.
Thanks. Sarah Toy, research fellow at UE and also work for Sustrans. Got probably two main points I'd like to raise. One is I've just spent the last nearly year now researching the social marketing approach to 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. So I feel like I've got a very deep and strange knowledge of why people choose to drive at the speeds they do, particularly in Bristol. And what's really struck me, talking to lots and lots of different people from different walks of life, is that they often understand that speeding's not a good idea in residential and urban areas intellectually, and emotionally they really want their streets to be safe and quiet, but they just don't behave in that way when they drive in other places. And I've termed the phrase Jimbyism. They just want it in their backyards. They want their street to be 20 miles an hour or less and nice and safe, but they actually don't give a damn where else they drive. And so I think with shared space, for me, the appeal is, I think it goes back a bit to what Keith said. Let's engage people in this debate. Let's really get them thinking about why they're behaving the way they do and understanding about speed and helping them to change their streets themselves. So I think lots of the community-led initiatives like DIY Streets are really helping people to actually engage with the reasons why they drive the way they do, because I think that is at the root of all this is about speed. And for me, shared space is absolutely fantastic if you've got cars driving at 10-15 miles an hour. And that takes me on to my other point, which I've sat here through the whole debate, and I came here with my own views, and I think I still hold on to them, which is that if we want to move, as a society, if we want to move away from oil dependency and away from car dependency, surely we want to discourage people from using cars. So for me, segregation is just a Trojan horse for continuing to legitimise the use of cars. So that's fine, just go somewhere else and drive however you want, as long as there's an alternative route, and that's fine, and we'll just make these spaces safe for pedestrians and cyclists. Whereas, I don't know if I'm sure many of you have come across the study Disappearing Traffic. The reality is, if you make it slightly more uncomfortable and difficult and confusing and complicated for people to use cars, that 25% of journeys that are under 2 miles will start to disappear. And for me, that's absolutely why my heart lies with the shared space, because it's about shifting the way people travel ultimately.
Yeah, I'm Ian Perry, and I've lived in Freiburg and the Netherlands, so I've experienced this firsthand. And for me, shared space has been overtaken by shared services, but for me, it's not about shared services, and I think it's very unfortunate that's happened. Talking about Freiburg, and having lived there, I was kind of surprised to how it described as it was, because the city centre of Freiburg is basically Broadmead with bobbly cobbles and trams, which is not ideal for cycling, and you're not allowed to cycle there anyhow. In Freiburg, you've got a situation where you have naked roads. There's no segregation. I once took to the pavement and got told off by a policeman. I once cycled the wrong way down Wye Street and got told off by a lady. So they're very rigid with their rules, and it's not need a shared space, maybe, but it's certainly not segregation. There are a lot of shared roads, and I'll give you one example of a change in thinking. I was turning left, and you've got a narrow street, and you've got the trams down the middle, so any car can't overtake a cyclist. A lady came down the road with the Freiburg mentality, and she stopped, waved me out the side junction, because that's what Germans do, very polite, and then she followed me into town because she couldn't get past me. Now, who in the UK would do that? But it's a change of thinking. There are no white markings on the roads, so everyone drives under 20 miles an hour. You put road markings down there, you mark off to give way, people can see it and they can drive 30, 40 miles an hour. In Freiburg, if you do that sort of thing, you're going to miss a junction and hit somebody. So they all drive very carefully. If I then sort of go on a little bit more about Freiburg, it's only when you leave the city and the speed limit increases in the open areas where you get the segregated footpaths normally. There are some on the pavement elsewhere, but I used to go on the road and shock the Germans because the footpaths were kind of dangerous because they were pedestrians. One of the busiest stretches of pavement from the city centre to the railway station was actually shared between pedestrians and cyclists. Now, the big difference between cyclists in the UK and the cyclists in Freiburg and the Netherlands as well was speed, and they all cycled much more slowly. Quickly about the Netherlands, Draken, the square about, it's very famous, I've been. I think it's fantastic, and it is segregation. Shared space is also about segregation. It's about thinking about the street. And the square about works very, very well. Everybody signals and goes around and all the cars wait. I've been around it a few times and I found everything to be okay. Another point about the Netherlands, very quickly, the last point, is the roundabouts. And you're probably familiar with the Dutch roundabout if you're a cyclist. And what you have normally is you have the roundabout for cars and around it a second roundabout for cyclists. Now normally the cyclist will get priority and the cars have to wait, but not always. And I spoke to a Dutch cycling expert and I said, look, I keep going across this roundabout, but I get stuck and I have to wait for ages and ages and ages till all these cars come past and I'm just sat there. This isn't right, I should get priority. And he said to me, well, why do you stop? Well, I said, there's all these cars, boom, 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 and then they're going the other way. So I took his advice. And I'm still here. So as I approached the roundabout, I stuck up my hand and I looked straight at the driver. I was a bit scared. And guess what? He stopped. And every time I went across the roundabout, I also put my hand out, looked at the drivers, and every time I made eye contact, they stopped. So it does kind of work. When you look at traffic, they are people normally and humans who are driving and not so scary.
I'd now like to ask our two debaters this evening to sum up their views on what they've heard in about 4 minutes, I'd say we've got now, rather than 5. So thank you very much. And I think we said that, Ben, you were going to go first.
Sure.
Yeah.
Boy, it's a big subject to try and do so, and I often feel like Gladstone's comment on two Glaswegian housewives who he encountered screaming at each other from different buildings in a narrow street, and he commented, they'll never agree, they're arguing from different premises, which in a way, I think that so much of our interpretation of what makes for successful cities or towns share a common interest, and I think there's probably more common ground than difference. But I do think that there's a slightly different approach that perhaps stems from the difference between an academic and research approach to these topics and the messy, compromise-ridden realities that one has to deal with in designing and delivering schemes on the ground. There are millions of mistakes in Ashford and other schemes that you look back and oh, if only we've been tougher insisting on that. But of course, you're constantly making compromises with the political realities of the space you deal with. Try working in Londonderry at the moment, and it's almost impossible to make a move without 5 ministers getting involved. So that my main, I suppose, conclusion about our discussions is that, and the reason that I favour an approach to shared space is because I think ultimately it goes with the grain of human behaviour, a phrase that the DFT used, and that I'm concerned about systems for towns and cities that rely on separation systems, regulation, legal structures, barriers, that mechanical ones or legal ones or signs and so on, because and time sharing. Because the more you do that, the more you dehumanize this messy interaction, which ultimately is, I think, what makes cities work well, which is why I like the San Francisco film. And that, I suppose my summary would be that it concludes the point about children. So ultimately our view of what streets should be is what our view about what life is about. And in my view, life is full of conflict. We accept that conflict is a legitimate and interesting part of social structures. Risk and hazards are an integral and vital part of life. And that includes that children's exposure in a certain context is important and useful. One example, one of the late ones of Hans Mondemann's example, where a primary school fronting onto a busy street, he extended, contrary to all expectations, extended the school playground across the street in order to influence the drivers and make children aware of traffic. It's a remarkable scheme. I didn't bother to include it today. But I do think that in our discussions there are clearly both different appropriate areas. I think that there's also an urban versus smaller rural issue. We tend to focus on Bristol city centre or London or major cities. and a great part of our work involves smaller market towns, thousands of villages, for whom separation or car-free environments, they simply look blank at you if you even mention it. And that the difference between what we would ideally like in an academic or detached standpoint and the realities of working at a community level, when communities want simple measures which can ameliorate, just reduce a little tad the impact of speeds and adverse traffic, is worthwhile. And so I hope that what, to some extent, the case for shared space will rest on is that traffic isn't some inanimate distance being. It's not something else. It is us, it is drivers, people, human beings wearing not a raincoat but a BMW or whatever it is. And that ultimately successful cities come from working with the grain of human behaviour, with all of its complexities and messiness.
Thank you. Steve.
Right, thank you. Likewise, there is so much to touch on here. I won't be able to do it all justice. To take Sarah's point about separation contributing to car culture, it depends, as with all these things, it depends how you separate it equally as much as it does how you share. To give an opposite example, we have here in South Gloucestershire at the moment where the plans for the bus rapid transit are doing exactly the opposite of what we should be doing if we really wanted to reduce car use, and that is that they are creating a mixed-use road which will essentially provide a new rapid route to get from Bradley Stoke straight to the motorway, undermining the whole point of having a bus rapid transit in the first place, which is that separating can actually give the bus an advantage. On the issue of safety, there is an awful lot, and I'll be writing some more about this whole question of safety and how evidence has sometimes been mispresented. The issue about safety of segregated paths is a complicated one. Are they safer or not compared to the mixed-use roads? There are many factors in that, but obviously one important issue is how well are they designed? And we have a lot of examples of very poor design in this country. Inclusivity, I believe, yes, has to be central to everything that we do. We would be failing if we were creating spaces which were fine for 90% of the population, but prevented people from certain disabilities from or even strongly discouraged people from certain disabilities from participating in public life. Quite a bit has been said about small towns, and I know Bradford-on-Avon reasonably, and I share your concerns about the prospect of trying to deal with that volume of traffic by simply putting in a shared space. More than we've got time for here, but I believe that part of the solution for smaller towns and villages ought to be what I call the slow bypass. And the reason that we don't have slow bypassing arrangements in this country goes down to essentially to the Department for Transport's method for appraising transport schemes, which means that you've actually got to get the traffic faster from A to B in order to justify the time savings that tick the boxes that say you can go ahead. If we can get rid of that stupid rule, I believe that we could make fantastic progress in our small towns and villages in sort of humanising them by removing traffic from where it's not meant to be. The last thing, and I think several people touched on this, is that there remains a significant job of research to do. And I don't buy, I think the criticism of academics that they split hairs and they love sort of arcane debates, is often justified. And I believe that without sort of exaggerating the situation, I believe that I can acquit most of my colleagues from that. I believe that if you want to research these issues in the real world and get your hands dirty with practical stuff, then the message is come to UE, because that's what we're all about here.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think you've almost saved me my concluding point. But just to reiterate, I think everybody, to some extent, has blamed the rules. But we clearly need some level of management of what's going on. Hopefully communities can be very involved. Community planning, nobody wants to criticise that. Inclusion was mentioned as an important issue. One other thing I think we should throw into the future mix is that we have changing technologies happening now. Anybody who's nearly been run over by a hybrid car already will know what I'm talking about. We're used to crossing roads with our ears, and that's going to have to end. Cycling, pedestrian conflict was a word Ben introduced. Several people mentioned that. Probably that's largely down to the same issues. Pedestrians don't really want to be alerted either with a bicycle bell ringing angrily behind them, or to discover that they've been close passed by a cycle that the cyclist couldn't make him or herself noisy enough. So my feeling is that we do need to have some better sense of categorisation going into the future, that we've talked about how segregation and sharing are in fact intertwined, but we need to understand more about the different kinds of shared spaces and avoid this more simplistic language. I think go back to the very beginning, our first intervention from Hugh Barton, who was identifying, are you talking about the same thing? And there is a basic question of understanding what kind of shared spaces we are talking about different times and different places. So perhaps you join me to thank the speakers again, and thanks to you for joining us on this evening. Hopefully there's still some sun out there to enjoy our shared spaces in. Thank you.